What are vintage clothing size conversions you need to know? Imagine finding that perfect vintage dress that fits just right, but the size label is from a different era. Understanding vintage clothing sizes can make shopping for these treasures much easier. Vintage sizes are quite different from modern ones, so knowing how to convert them helps you find pieces that fit well and look fantastic. Unlike today's sizing, which is often based on standardized measurements, vintage sizes were created based on different body measurements and fashion standards of their time. For example, a vintage size 20 to 24 from the 1940s to the 1960s roughly equals a modern United States size 12 to 14, but this can change depending on the brand and decade. The best way to shop vintage is to measure yourself accurately and compare those measurements to the actual measurements of the garment. Vintage clothing often comes with detailed flat measurements, like the bust measured from armpit to armpit, and then doubled to get the full circumference. Remember, there is no exact one-to-one conversion for vintage to modern sizes because sizing standards varied widely. For example, a vintage small from the 1950s might have a bust measurement of 33 inches, which is similar to a modern extra small. A vintage large from the 1970s might have a bust of 40 inches, aligning more with a modern size 16. Foundation garments like girdles and structured brass were common in vintage times, shaping the body differently than modern undergarments. This means vintage clothing might feel tighter or different unless you wear similar foundations or make alterations. When sewing vintage patterns, check the measurements listed on the pattern envelope because they often do not match modern sizes. Vintage patterns usually come in a single size, so adjusting or grading the pattern to fit your measurements is essential. Sizes also changed over time, with sizes in the 1950s generally smaller than those in the 1970s. Always check the specific garment's measurements and consider the era it comes from. To style vintage pieces confidently, take your measurements carefully and compare them to the flat measurements provided by sellers. If a vintage piece is close but not perfect, alterations can help achieve a better fit. Fabrics from vintage clothing tend to have less stretch than modern fabrics, so keep that in mind for comfort. Shopping from sellers who provide detailed sizing info or trying on vintage pieces when possible makes the process easier. Knowing these size conversion basics helps you select vintage clothing that fits well and complements your style. It makes styling vintage pieces more fun and less stressful, so you can enjoy adding unique retro styles to your wardrobe with confidence.